Good evening, church. We're continuing our discussion groups as we have been spending some time talking about various apologetic arguments that relate to the existence of God and the fact that we can reason and we can have evidence because of reason and logic for our faith. It's not a blind faith. It's not something that we just take for granted and say we just acknowledge God so that makes it okay. Christian faith is thought out, and Christian thought is well developed and based on God's word and the scripture. And we have talked a multitude of things, from the law of non-contradiction to the law of causality. We've talked about the cosmological arguments, the teleological arguments, the ontological arguments, and tonight we'll be dealing with morality, the argument for morality about the existence of God. And to be sure, these are just useful tools, and it's one reason that we are exploring them. When we are called to defend our faith, we need to be able to explain that with good reason and good evidence, and we need to spend time making sure that we can articulate that. You may believe in the existence of God and you may acknowledge many of his truths. But if you are going to be skilled in defending the word, and if you're going to help people connect with the existence of God and the reality of who they could be through Jesus, being able to articulate evidential reasons for following God is really important for your own faith and for that of others. And that's why we're spending time doing this, to equip ourselves, to make sure we have the tools. That's why I appreciate the questions when we break up into discussion groups. There's been such good questions. Really appreciated last week that even though that not everyone initially and maybe even now agreed with all of the points of them, the kind of conversation was uplifting and edifying, and it was a safe space to be able to do that. Man, I love that about church. I love the contributions. One person doesn't have all the answers, God alone does. But as the church, as a group of people, we can sort through these things together, humbly and seeking truth. And I really respect and appreciate everyone who's contributed to that. If you remember a few weeks ago, we'd spent time talking about Romans chapter 12. We looked at verse 2, verse 9, and verse 21. We were talking about the goodness of God. And there was one particular thing that we pointed out in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, that there was a requirement that we would to be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. There was an expectation that by being a Christian, we should develop our minds to be able to discern what is the perfect and good and acceptable will of God. You may have noticed on Sunday mornings when we've switched gears to talking about God we talked about these characteristics of God, that he is self-existent, because it is a major factor of many of these arguments. And this morning, it was no accident that we talked about the holiness of God, his righteousness, that there is a right and there is a wrong in the world, and it is defined by God. We talked about it because we need to know that about God. And it also plays into our understanding of the moral argument. Now, when we talk about morality, there's a thing that the argument is going to hinge on, and that is whether there are objective moral values and duties in the universe, universal moral objective values, meaning no matter where you are in this world right now, there is a moral value that holds true. No matter what culture you come from, there's a moral values that do hold true. Now, it doesn't mean all of them, it could just mean a certain amount for a particular time. Let me give you an example. There are certain stories that you hear, real things that you can observe and know about, and there's a beauty to it that exists. You may not believe in God, you may believe in God, but when you hear about moral excellence, there's a thing that resonates with people. It really does. I have a friend, and he was posting about his brother this morning, and I thought, what a really great story. True story. I think it happened yesterday or the day before one. And the brother, a little bit younger, was riding a bicycle through town, exercising. And it's a small town back where I'm from, and near where I'm from. And he came across a kid next to a lawnmower, and the kid was trying to sell the lawnmower. So Brad stopped and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Trying to sell this lawnmower." "Well, he's trying to sell a lawnmower. I want a bicycle." So Brad goes, "You want to do a trade?" And the kid's like, "What? Yeah, yes." Even that part of the story was fantastic. The fact that you would give up your bike just to help this kid out as part of your community, there's a thing that's beautiful about that. Absolutely beautiful about it. The truth is, the story takes a little bit of a turn because when Brad tries to start the mower, it doesn't work. And Brad's like, "Wait a minute. How do you start this mower?" And the kid says, "Well, you got to cuss at it. And Brad, who's a preacher, says, I kind of forgot how to cuss. And the kid's like, you pull that rope long enough, you'll learn again. I was like, all right. I'm going to assume that's completely true and that his brother didn't change that, but the part where you're willing to give up a thing simply to benefit another person is beautiful. It's moral excellence. To esteem someone better than yourself, well, that's Bible. That's Jesus, isn't it? To sacrifice a bit that other person could be elevated, man, that's beautiful. And even if a person does not believe in God or doesn't believe in any other thing in the universe other than themselves, we have to accept that there's a thing there that resonates with us, and it pushes us to the possibility that there is universal moral duties that are excellent and beautiful. I think of that in the Bible. There's so many stories that resonate in the Bible that demonstrate this, and there's a reason we repeat them. And even for people that don't believe in the Bible, I was really fortunate to grow up in that small town where religious leaders were allowed to come to our schools and would give us Bible lessons. They could do that, and there was no problem. If you didn't want to, you could go into the library if that was an issue, and they allowed for that. Not a big deal. But there was a lot of kids and a lot of people that just didn't go to church. I don't know about a lot, but there were several. But they would still hear these stories. And you would hear about these moral, historical, we would call them historical accounts. And it would be like, wow, that's incredible. You think about the story of Gideon the judge, and who was called by God to lead the people, to free the people during the time of Judges. And he was given this impossible task to lead a small army. And initially, I believe it was 32,000 people up against this mighty, mighty, mighty army. And it was incredible. There was no way that was going to happen. And God said, but wait, I need you to cut that number down. And he did. And I need you to cut it down further to the point where they ended up with only 300 people. Only 300 to go up this mighty army. But Gideon showed this excellence of courage and bravery and doing a thing that was true and right because God said to do it. And he doubted himself, but he pressed on. Incredible, just incredible story. You think about the righteousness and the moral excellence of Noah. We mentioned him this morning, to keep himself pure and right in a world where he's surrounded by so many people that had turned against God. Whoa, the story resonates. Not just because he built this incredible boat and survived, but because he kept himself pure and honored God. Oh, powerful story. Powerful story. Or Joseph, when he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, he knew it was not right that he should be with another man's wife, and so he fled to maintain his purity and do what was right. That's a mix of some very, very popular stories and some less so, but they resonate with people. Jesus wanted us, the Son of God wanted us to know sort of what that looked like. God communicates what that looks like. It comes from him. It emanates from him, his holiness, what is right and what is good. Jesus was teaching, and one of the most famous of all time is the Good Samaritan. And I want us to stop and think about that. Is Jesus presenting this tale of the Good Samaritan, which many of you already know this, and if not, we'll read it here in just a second. But it is this tale that hits because even if you don't believe in God, and even if you have assigned yourself to simply be an atheist or an agnostic or some other thing, there's a part of the morality of this that resonates because it's standing up for the weak, because it's sacrificing to do better for someone else. And that hits on a very human level and causes us to think the possibility of a universal, objective, moral truth. This is what Jesus wanted us to hear with this parable of the Good Samaritan. And remember, parables are quite different than fables, and the fact that these are things that normally can happen. It's events that can happen. They're very possible. There's no foxes that speak or toads that, whatever. This is a thing that can happen. And there's a lesson about the kingdom of heaven in this, and there's a lesson about what we should be. It's a moral lesson, an objective moral truth Jesus is getting at. So, behold, a certain lawyer stood up to him. I'm in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. A certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?" And he said, "Well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered rightly. Do this and you will live." But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus answered and said, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at that place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, and he brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and he said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I come again, I will repay you." So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." You may be tempted to think, well, that is a morality that is clearly based out of sort of a Judaic mindset, a morality that stems from the law. Or you may be tempted to think that, well, maybe this was a tradition out of the area and the culture that they came from. But if we're being honest, is it? Is it? You don't have to be from this culture. You don't have to be from that moral background. When you hear the first part of that story, that there's a man who's been unjustly attacked, an innocent person, there's a thing that resonates. I've seen this resonate, observed this resonate in a multitude of people from a multitude of backgrounds. Whether they know it's a Bible story or not isn't what caused them to resonate, or so they thought. I believe things do come from God, and there's a natural connection in those. But that aside, the idea that this man was attacked is horrific. Robbed. He did nothing wrong. That catches people. Second, that someone would see a man in pain, in suffering, that had been treated unjustly and would do nothing? How does that not stir you? And not one, but a second man would go by and do nothing and let his suffering continue in that when you were capable in that moment? Beyond that, if you know that it's a Levite, and if you know that it's the people that's involved in this, you would go, aren't they obligated to do something to it by their own moral values? And then this guy, Samaritan, comes along. And you don't even have to know. If you do, it adds to the parable, but you don't even have to know the tensions that existed between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. You don't even have to know that. A guy comes along from Samaria, and he gets involved, and he takes care of the man. And beyond just saying, "Hey, I hope you get feeling better, good job, buddy," and flips him a coin or lays a cloth on him, he tends his wounds and he takes care of him, and he goes even further, in which he takes him to an inn, and he goes even further and says, whatever he needs, I'll pay for it. This flies in the face of, sort of a naturalism sense of morality, where we think, well, we're going to do what we can to benefit ourselves and for the sake of survival. There's nothing that benefits the Samaritan for doing this. It's simply elevating someone who was in need, and that resonates with us. It's moral excellence. There's something beautiful about this that exists that we can appreciate. And so it's striking. Now, as you read the Bible, it's even more striking that Jesus would give this example. When you know what's going to happen, he's going to go to the cross, and at great expense to himself, he's going to take care of the people who cannot take care of themselves. It points in that direction. And the beauty and the magnitude of that is difficult to comprehend for sure. But it hits us, it resonates with us. A universal, an objective, moral truth. So the argument for morality that stems from this is that there must be a universal, objective morality. But here's how it starts. And this really kind of struck in the mid-20th century with a lot of people. I think that's when it really hit a zenith in recent history. And this is sort of how, I believe it was C.S. Lewis that kind of penned this together. If there is a universal moral law, there is a moral lawgiver. Okay, that makes sense. If there is a moral lawgiver, it must be something beyond the universe. Because if the authority that stems from it affects universally, and then it has to be beyond the universe to have such authority over the universe and creation itself. So if there is a moral lawgiver, it must be something beyond the universe, because the universe is subject to it, from the great cosmos down to individual characters. Okay. There is a universal moral law. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Therefore, the moral lawgiver is beyond the universe, which in turn could lead someone reasonably to look to the existence of God. There's a second argument that comes out of this as well, and it's a little bit more, it's unique in the fact that it starts with a denial. It's a denial stop in which the second statement is going to deny the first. Here's what we mean. If God did not exist, so he's just laying out very blatantly, if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. So baked into that is an understanding of who God is, and there's a theology that ties with that, which is one of the reasons we've been going through biblical theology on God is, because it's baked into these, and that may require some explanation. But if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. It's very simple. It's very simple. And what it's getting at. And what's really interesting is on this one, it's funny who might agree with this. There are people who do not believe in God, but they will believe point 2. They absolutely will believe point number 2. They just don't believe point 3, and they might, some of them actually will talk about point 1. It's really fascinating in that regard. There's one guy in particular I was reading, and he does believe in number 2, that there are objective moral values and duties, but he thinks they're just foundational elements of the universe. And they don't have to have an explanation of where they come from. They just exist, just like any other law that exists. And he doesn't feel like he has to explain where they come from. Interesting. But these are two popular versions of the law from morality. And like I said, in about the middle of the 20th century, this was a very popular discussion point and argument. We're going to dive into it. We're going to discuss it a little bit more and kind of parse it about a little bit. And I want you to think about some things. How does this tie to the definition of the God of the Bible? How does this support that, or what's problematic from it? You may even think about your favorite or your most inspirational or beautiful example of moral excellence that you've seen. You may even be thinking about, well, if there are objective moral values and duties, what are they? What are they? Can we talk about what they may be? When I was a teenager, I went to nerd camp, and we had one major rule during our nerd camps, 5 weeks. There was 2 campuses. The other campus had all these laws, tons and tons and tons of rules. I mean, loads of rules. We had one. You can do pretty much whatever you want, so as long as it doesn't harm or offend anybody else. Sounds great. You can see the roots of some sort of other mindset and philosophy that's coming out of that, relativism. This was the early 90s. You can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm or offend anyone else. Well, that narrowed down a lot of things that we could and could not do, okay? They had less rules. Because of that rule, when we had talent nights, you couldn't say any profanities at all. We don't want to harm or offend anyone. The other campus could say all they wanted. It was wild, the differences that came out of that. But even if you are a relativist and you hear that rule, do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm someone, you have accepted that there is a universal standard, an objective moral truth, at least one, do no harm, that you're agreeing on. And that's an interesting one. Thank you, Siri, for finding that one online. Not shaming anybody at all. Those things happen. But there's things that we agree on, and that's a thing worth talking about when we get to our discussion groups. So be mindful of that. Tonight, we're glad you're here. We're going to close out with an invitation. And we want you to know that there is a morality, there's a standard by which we will be judged. This is what the Bible says. God's appointed a day in which we will be judged. And it will be according to the standard that He's set by the law of Christ. This is a fact. People could choose to deny that fact, and some do. But it's still a fact. And so we're still going to teach it as truth. Not because we are wanting to push people away or tell them, they're wrong or they're in a hateful way or without caring. In fact, quite the opposite. The reality of that truth is there is a judgment day that's coming, and God has provided a way where we don't have to worry about that judgment day. We can know that we have salvation, and it comes through Jesus. We can know if we are living in faith because we have a moral standard that God has clearly put forth for us to follow. We don't have to guess about right and wrong. He's given us mental faculties to be able to discern it based on His Word. He's given us motivations and choices and encouragement to follow it based on His Word. We can choose, we can know, and tonight we offer the invitation because that's reality. And the way that you choose to live your life will affect that day for sure. My encouragement here is not to fear that day, but to look forward to that day, and rejoicing that when Jesus comes again, you will be ready. You will be certain. You will be confident. That's the hope we have because of the promises of our God, who is self-existent, who is holy, who sets the standard, who is the authority for us to follow. That's the confidence we have. Christianity is a powerful, powerful gift from God. Our invitation is for you to choose to be a part of it. That's what God wants, and he loves you so much for it. If there's a way that we can help you understand that in the Bible, if there's a way that we can serve you through his word, if there's a way that we can show we love you in that, please let us know. You are loved. You matter deeply to us, but most of all to God. If there's a way we can help you, let us know as we stand and as we sing.